Let me begin with a point that sounds strange at first, but I think it is the only way to make sense of how extreme some of these predictions have become. A lot of people still insist on reading this war only through ordinary political logic. Who has more missiles? Who has more money? Who made a tactical mistake? Who escalated too quickly? Who misread the other side? Those questions matter. But there is another layer of interpretation that many actors, especially the most ideological actors, genuinely use when they think about the world. They do not look only at power politics. They look at prophecy. They look at eschatology. And once you begin taking that seriously, not as theology you personally have to believe, but as a framework that actual political and religious actors may use to orient themselves, then a number of otherwise irrational developments begin to look much more coherent. This is what I mean when I talk about the law of eschatological convergence. Different religious traditions have different end-time stories. Different political movements have different sacred narratives. Different civilizations imagine history reaching its climax in different ways. But if you take the most extreme versions of those narratives and put them side by side, you start noticing something remarkable. At certain points, they converge. They begin wanting the same geopolitical events, even if for different theological reasons. And once you see those convergence points, you can begin making predictions about what kind of crises powerful actors may consciously or unconsciously push toward over the next 2 to 4 years. That is the argument I want to lay out. Now, the first thing this framework suggests is that the United States will eventually use ground troops. A lot of people still resist this idea because they think ground invasion is too costly, too unpopular, too obviously disastrous, but that is precisely the point. Using ground troops is not only a military decision, it is a political accelerator. Once ground troops are used at scale, you reopen the question of national mobilization, you reopen the question of the draft, and the moment the draft enters the conversation, you are no longer only fighting a foreign war, you are creating the conditions for domestic fracture inside the United States itself. Large numbers of young people will refuse to fight. Protests will intensify. The state will respond. The National Guard becomes politically central. And once the National Guard becomes politically central in a climate of mass refusal, the line between foreign war and domestic conflict becomes very thin. This is why I think the use of ground troops would not merely expand the war in the Middle East. It would begin remaking the United States internally. Now notice how dark this logic is. Ground troops do not appear here because they are the best way to achieve a clean military victory. Ground troops appear because the logic of escalation keeps pushing the system in that direction, even though the domestic consequences are catastrophic. And once that happens, the second prediction follows very naturally. The United States loses the war. I do not mean it loses every battle. I do not mean the American military becomes weak overnight. I mean something more structural. It gets drawn into the wrong kind of war, under the wrong political conditions, against the wrong kind of opponent, in a way that eventually destroys its ability to maintain the regional architecture it once controlled. That means CENTCOM, the Central American Military Command System in the Middle East, loses its old role as the unquestioned organizing center. And once American command weakens, the regional map has to be reorganized around new poles of power. That brings us to the Gulf. A lot of people still do not understand how central the GCC economies are to this entire story. These economies are not just rich. They are embedded in a much larger system of oil flows, shipping flows, food import dependence, financial recycling, and regional political dependence. If those economies are systematically damaged, then what is being destroyed is not just wealth. What is being destroyed is relevance. That is why some actors seem willing to let the GCC burn. If your long-term project requires those economies to become politically weaker, strategically dependent, or incapable of independent regional leadership, then destroying their infrastructure is not collateral damage. It is part of the plan. This is where the language of Greater Israel, Pax Judaica, and wider civilizational transformation enters the picture. Now, I want to be careful here. These are not neutral policy concepts. They are ideological and theological concepts. but that is exactly why they matter. Greater Israel refers to a territorial imagination, the belief that a specific land inheritance promised in sacred history must eventually be politically realized. Pax Judaica, in the most extreme readings, goes even further. It is not just about territory, it is about political order, a one-world system, a technologically integrated surveillance order, a regime of control in which capital, intelligence, and high-end computing converge around a new sacred center of power. Once you see that distinction, a lot of things that look messy begin fitting together. Territory is one layer. Technological concentration is another. War then becomes a mechanism not merely for punishment, but for recentering power. And that is why the argument becomes so radical. Under this reading, capital and technology would increasingly flow toward Israel. Artificial intelligence firms, computing power, surveillance infrastructure, security capital, all of it would begin concentrating where the future center of power is expected to be. Now, whether you believe this fully or not is actually not the first issue. The first issue is whether actors inside the system behave as though they believe it. That is the crucial question, because once enough powerful people start acting according to eschatological expectations, the difference between prophecy and policy begins to collapse. Now let us move back to the material level, because without the material level, the whole argument floats away into abstraction. One objection people often raise is simple. Maybe Trump is not following any grand eschatological script. Maybe he is just arrogant. Maybe he thought Iran would be another Venezuela. Maybe he thought pressure would produce collapse. Maybe the administration simply made a stupid move and is now trapped in the consequences. That objection matters. And I actually think it is stronger than many ideological people want to admit. It is entirely possible that the process began with miscalculation rather than destiny. But here is the problem. Once you start a war, your original intentions stop mattering as much as the new structural realities the war creates. And in this case, those realities are brutal. Iran's core advantage is not that it can outfight the United States conventionally. Iran's advantage is that the GCC cannot truly defend itself. The geography matters here. The Gulf monarchies are exposed. Iran is far more defensible. Iran can launch rockets and drones. Iran can threaten shipping. Iran can hold the Strait of Hormuz at risk. And the bases that the GCC believed would defend them have now revealed that they cannot even fully defend themselves. That changes everything, because once confidence in those bases collapses, the whole Gulf order begins to wobble. Now imagine Trump decides this war is foolish and wants to go home. Many people assume that would be the rational exit. But the structure of the region makes it much more complicated. If the United States leaves, Iran does not simply disappear. Iran then turns to the GCC and says, "You helped attack us. You helped destroy our infrastructure. You helped damage our economy. Now you owe compensation." And beyond compensation comes a second layer. If Iran controls the strategic choke point, then every ship that wants to pass, every commercial route, every export flow becomes taxable in practice. A toll regime emerges. The very money that once flowed from the GCC into wider American-linked financial circuits begins flowing instead toward Iran. This is the key reversal before Gulf energy. Wealth fed the broader American-centered system. Now, under this scenario, that money gets rerouted. And what would Iran do with that money? Repair its economy, industrialize rapidly, rebuild state capacity, convert survival into regional primacy, 5 years, 10 years, maybe less if the dislocation is severe enough. Under that logic, Iran does not merely survive the war, it becomes the central power of the Middle East. Now, think about what that means for the United States. If Washington leaves, it loses the Gulf. If it loses the Gulf, it loses not only influence, but money, leverage, and the wider financial circuitry tied to Gulf capital and energy. If that financial circuitry weakens badly enough, the U.S. economy itself begins entering crisis. And once the American economy enters crisis, domestic unrest appears anyway. This is why the trap is so severe. Stay, and the war becomes longer, bloodier, and more politically explosive at home. Leave, and you risk economic collapse, strategic humiliation, and revolutionary pressure inside the United States anyway. That is why I keep saying this. War cannot simply be ended by declaration. Once started, it reorganizes the incentives of every major actor. Now widen the circle again. Turkey enters, Saudi Arabia enters. Europe weakens, NATO frays. Ukraine becomes part of the same wider transformation rather than a separate theater. This is where the theory becomes even more ambitious. The same war system that weakens the Gulf also weakens opposition to wider eschatological projects. Turkey and Saudi Arabia, in entering the war, would not emerge stronger. They would be damaged, exhausted, and more vulnerable. The axis of resistance, as we know it, might be destroyed in one sense. But another regional force, a renewed Persia, could rise out of the conflict. That rise of Persia then serves yet another eschatological role. In some prophetic interpretations, Persia and Russia become key components of the final coalition marching toward the sacred center. So under the logic of convergence, it is not actually a contradiction if Iran wins part of the war. That victory may itself be necessary for later stages of the prophetic map. Notice how strange this becomes from a purely realpolitik perspective. If you only think politically, much of this war appears irrational, self-destructive, contradictory. But once you examine it through eschatological convergence, it suddenly looks more internally coherent. Events that seem senseless begin making sense because they are serving multiple sacred narratives at the same time. This also explains why Europe and NATO appear, under the most extreme reading, not as permanent anchors of order, but as structures destined to weaken. Russia's war in Ukraine is no longer only about borders or NATO expansion. It becomes part of a larger prophetic reordering. The weakening of Europe, the collapse of NATO, the recovery of older civilizational ambitions, the possibility that Greece, Turkey, Russia, and Constantinople all re-enter history under a different symbolic logic. Again, I am not saying you must believe this as literal prophecy. I am saying that if enough people act as if these stories are real, they become geopolitically consequential, whether or not secular analysts approve. That is the point modern political science often misses. It treats religion as background culture. But at moments of extreme crisis, religion can become strategic software. And once it becomes software, it begins processing state behavior in ways that ordinary realism alone cannot explain. So what do I think the deepest lesson is? It is this. The war is no longer controlled by the intentions that started it. Maybe Trump was arrogant. Maybe he was stupid. Maybe he misread Iran. Maybe he thought this would be quick. All of that may be true. But once the war crossed a certain threshold, intentions became less important than convergence. Different actors with different goals. Now all benefit in different ways from the same escalatory outcomes: ground troops, draft, civil conflict in America, destruction of GCC relevance, expansion of Israeli power, technological concentration, the rise of Persia, the weakening of Europe, the fraying of NATO. Once these outcomes begin supporting multiple ideological and geopolitical projects simultaneously, the war acquires momentum far beyond the control of any one leader. That is what makes it so dangerous. It is no longer just a conflict. It is a convergence engine. And once a convergence engine is running, the question is no longer whether a leader wants to stop. The question is whether the system still contains enough counterforces to stop itself. That is the question I do not think enough people are asking. Because if the answer is no, then the next 2 to 4 years are not going to look like a normal continuation of the old world. They are going to look like the violent construction of a new one.